Few submarines evoke a feeling of tragedy as much as the Submarine K-19. A story of human sacrifice, desperation, and exploitation. A story equally so iconic that it birthed a Hollywood movie, Widowmaker. But a film cannot claim to do this story justice. The accidents aboard this submarine have claimed at least 52 lives, span multiple decades, and are going to continue to make news stories for decades to come. There is a reason Submarine K-19 has acquired a poignant nickname, Hiroshima. She is the Hiroshima of the seas. K-19 was first envisioned as competition to US missile submarines already in development, the first of these being the USS George Washington. Not the giant aircraft carrier, but the submarine that began construction in November of 1958 and launched in 1959. Designated Project 658, the government proposal to build these missile submarines was signed August 25, 1956, and they began laying down the submarine in mid-October of 1958, a few weeks before the USS George Washington began assembly. The difference was that they were assembling Project 658 without any initial plans to maximise efficiency. This had the opposite effect. Finalising the submarine was slow and delayed. The original chief designer, Pyotr Golosovsky, was replaced by Igor Mikhailov, who was promoted to State Committee for Shipbuilding and replaced by Sergei Kovalev. The technology available changed as the design was being made, and this leads to some unusual structural choices. One example of this is the pointed bow of the submarine. This was to allow for stability and movement at the surface, as they were originally going to use surface-launched missiles on the submarine. This design was replaced with underwater-launched missiles in March of 1958, creating Project 658M, but it was too late to install these on K-19, and so the submarine was assembled without them. Construction was complex and hasty, to say the least, with 3,000 people working across 3 shifts daily. The submarine was assembled longitudinally in modules, in contrast to the normal transverse assembly of Soviet submarines before, and slowly the behemoth that would become K-19 began to take shape. It was here during construction that K-19 took its first lives. While the hull was being coated with a rubber seal, a fire broke out in the ballast tanks. 2 people were caught in the blaze, and it proved fatal. After they had cleared the mess and repaired the hull, they moved on to painting it. Here, a woman suffocated in the paint fumes and became the 3rd fatality of K-19. The one thing not unplanned from the start was the reactor and turbine compartments. As you may be unsurprised to know, this reactor was again designed by 2 very frequently referenced people on this channel, Anatoly Alexandrov and Nikolai Dolezal. The VMA reactor was a water-cooled, water-moderated reactor, encased in carbon steel, very innovative for its time. This is, of course, very fortunate, as Dolezal initially pushed for a graphite-moderated channel reactor, comparable to an RBMK, instead. This was vetoed to conserve on space and fuel enrichment, which even in the VMA was already at 21%. This reactor pioneered submarine development, able to use the equipment and metal structures of the reactor as shielding from radiation in the confined space of a submarine. It was smaller, more efficient, and lighter than anything the USA had designed at the time. As a sign of superiority, especially in the Cold War, the designers installed 2 of them onto a submarine, giving it a total of 140 megawatts of electricity, and it still weighed less than the S-5W reactor used on the USS George Washington, K-19's rival, which only produced 78 megawatts of electricity. Even more innovative was the fuel assembly design, with each of them in a specially designed removable block. In the event of an emergency, a single fuel rod, or the entire fuel inventory, could be ejected from the core, ending the reaction. The reactor also had what is referred to as a compensating grid. This is just another name for the control rod assembly. Just keep that in mind so you don't get confused. There were, of course, also many issues with these reactors, which were initially apparent in the testing phase of the reactor prototype, the 27VM. When they initially raised the power in the 27VM in April of 1956, things were successful, if you ignore the constant shutdowns for coolant leaks or equipment failing. However, at the end of the year, there was an accident resulting in the partial destruction of the reactor, and a release of coolant water into the workspace, heavily contaminated from the reactor. 27VM was destroyed, and the scientists pioneering her had to learn from their mistakes for the lives of the submarine crews they would be placing the VMA in the hands of. To give a brief summary of the compartments in this submarine, as it will be important later. From front to back, we have the front torpedo compartment, the battery compartment, the central command compartment, the missile compartment, the diesel generator compartment, the reactor compartment, the turbine compartment, the electric motor compartment, the auxiliary machinery compartment, and the aft compartment. A very well-designed modular submarine born from a lack of design, even by today's standards. While the submarine struggled under design issues, a crew had already been formed in Obninsk 10 months before the construction even began. They needed rigorous training to operate the submarine. To celebrate the position, the Soviet state rewarded the crew with fresh food and luxuries, hoping to keep them motivated. And alas, the day has arrived. October 11th, 1959, and the submarine was ready to be moved out of the dry dock for fitting. The crew of the submarine was gathered for the moment, in a grand ceremony. As tradition entails, a champagne bottle was to be smashed against the hull. Normally, this is done by a woman, but the Soviets decided to break tradition and elected Captain Panov to swing the bottle. And when he swung it, it slid along the propellers onto the rubberized hull of the vessel and did not smash. What a sign of bad luck, on top of what already had the superstitious worried. But the ship was still towed out and connected to the destroyer-turned-floating base Baku, which in its last years of life supplied steam to allow for K-19 to be fitted out. And somehow, this is about the only time in the history of the submarine where a catastrophic accident did not occur. But this was never going to last, because once the fitting out was complete, it was time for the mooring trials. 3 months into these trials in January of 1960, it was time to load up and start the reactor. This didn't go to plan, of course. Remember the compensating grid? During testing while the reactor was active, the control rod was pushed down so far that it hit the end stop at the bottom of the core and bent the rod, destroying the entire active zone of the reactor. The entire core had to be opened up, all the fuel had to be removed, and the entire control rod system had to be replaced, along with much of the reactor equipment damaged by the bent rod. Total cost, 34 million rubles. Captain Panov was demoted, and the operator was removed from the submarine. I mentioned that the reactor was running for what came next. Apparently, while they were opening up the core to fix the problem, the mechanics found several large black beetles living quite calmly in the graphite grease, the lubrication of the VMA reactor. How these beetles got in there is unknown, and how they were still alive is equally unknown, as the reactor had been running at quite high powers before, not to mention the temperatures. These mystery beetles were seized by scientific bodies, and nobody found out what happened to them. What nobody noticed was that the pressure gauge for the reactor was improperly installed. The reactor, designed to operate with a pressure of 200 atmospheres, went beyond 400. This issue was never reported, and no maintenance to repair any damage took place. On July 12, 1960, the naval flag was raised. It was time for the sea trials, a 5-day process. On one of its first times diving, it turned out that the depth rudder had been installed incorrectly. The submarine plummeted at a speed of 20 knots to the bottom of the sea, where it would have impacted and killed all those on board. Fortunately, one of the sailors noticed this in time and was able to take evasive action, resurfacing and allowing the depth rudder to be replaced. Other than that, they were a success. Then it was time for the state acceptance trials. The submarine, under its own power, chartered out for a 3-month journey across the White Sea, covering nearly 11,000 kilometers alongside a support vessel. On one of these trials, the submarine successfully survived 5 days underwater. When they surfaced, however, the protective rubberized coating had been almost entirely stripped from the hull. It would need to be fully replaced. And then they attempted a dive to 280 meters, the operating limit of the submarine. Here they encountered another issue. A faulty gasket had not been replaced during maintenance, and it failed. Water sprayed right into the reactor compartment. As the information passed through the submarine, the captain, Nikolai Zateyev, ordered the dive to continue. The reactor operators would just have to deal with it. But the spray quickly turned to fog, and it soon became impossible to see anything in the compartment, and that fog eventually settled into water, which filled the compartment. Finally, Zateyev admitted it was too dangerous to continue, and the submarine began an emergency raise, blowing out the ballast tanks. But with the water in the submarine and the speed of their resurfacing, the ship's balance was completely out of control. First, the hull listed 45 degrees to starboard, and then back the other way, 45 degrees to port. After several more rocks, it stabilised, and the submarine was saved. This would not be the only accident of these trials. In October, crew were removing the wood of a broken food crate through a system to remove waste from compartment 9. It turned out that the wood was too large to fit through the discharge point, jamming in the open position. Water rapidly entered compartment 9, flooding it. But again, no injuries or fatalities, and the water was pumped out. Despite all the accidents and mishaps, the trials were overall a complete success, and on November 12, 1960, the Soviet government accepted K-19 into the Navy. Transferred to the 206th Submarine Brigade of the Northern Fleet, the submarine made its way to Malaya Lopatka Bay, part of the Zapadne naval base. To get there, the submarine had to sail north through the Arctic Sea and avoid ice to reach the destination. And you know what? Nothing went wrong here. Well done. But this glimmer of luck wouldn't last to the end of the year. While operating the reactor in dock, the operators accidentally let the coolant level flowing through those compensators spike, which caused massive vibrations destroying the bearings of the main circulation pump, which in turn destroyed the pump itself. A team from Severodvinsk was called out to fix the pump, but they weren't able to open up the hull of the submarine to do so. Instead, they took a replacement pump, dragged it through from the 3rd to the 6th compartment, and installed it. Then, they dragged the faulty pump back out to scrap it. It's finally time for K-19 to join the submarine service. And as a missile submarine, it needs missiles, of course. And so, before it joins the 206th Submarine Brigade, it was loaded with 3 R-13 ballistic missiles, designed to carry up to a 2 megaton yield nuclear bomb. Unfortunately, one sailor was caught out by the movement of a silo cover and crushed to death during the loading. And then it was time for the submarine to take to the seas. And over the first half of 1961, K-19 would cover 5,892 miles underwater, and a further 529 above the surface. But the 3 sorties K-19 undertook would be marred by 2 catastrophes in 3 months. Not too far from its base, in the Barents Sea, K-19 was performing usual duties, 50 metres underwater, when the horizontal rudders, controlling whether the submarine dived or raised, jammed in the most extreme dive position. The ship took a sudden nosedive downwards, diving straight for the seabed 250 metres beneath them. Panicking, the crew blew the ballast tanks at the front and middle of the ship, pushing out the pressurised water and filling them with air. This still didn't slow the descent of the submarine, the propellers driving it down into the depths. In one last desperate attempt, they used the turbine's reversers, which reversed the propellers, and the descent slowed, and the ship levelled out. But it was too late to avoid collision with the bottom of the sea, and the bow of the submarine scraped along the seabed, kicking up silt. And then she began to raise again, the front lurching back up towards the sea surface. To try and level her out, they blew the aft ballast tanks, but it was too little, too late. The ship surfaced, bow first, and collapsed back into the sea. And somehow, they survived. Out in the open waters, the crew managed to successfully repair the rudder system, putting them back in control of the submarine's ability to rise or descend. And then they began to take on water again, to fill their ballast tanks so they could dive once more. As they moved against the waves at a very slow speed, the hydroacoustic operator heard a sudden ping to the starboard. An object had appeared from the MG-10 hydrophone's blind spot. It was a submarine, and it killed its propellers, approaching quietly. As it turns out, the operator of this submarine made a sudden bad manoeuvre. It rose to the surface, and both of them were on track for a collision course. They had to slow down. The K-19 crew jumped into action, orders were shouted, the submarine was put into full astern, and the turbines reversed for a second time that day. K-19 slowed down, and, narrowly, the hull of the unknown submarine passed in front of K-19, diving as it moved to their left. The submarine zigzagged as it disappeared under the waves, the sound on the hydrophone growing fainter. And somehow, the crew survived 2 near wipeouts within 12 hours. For those of you curious, the submarine they almost hit was the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear submarine. Remember that pressure gauge incident where the reactor spiked to 400 atmospheres instead of 200? Well, half a year later, it's finally time for that Chekhov's gun to fire. K-19 is off the southeastern coast of Greenland with its crew on July 4th, 1961, performing a naval exercise alongside diesel submarines. Soon, it will return to the USSR to conduct a missile launch to demonstrate the capabilities of the crew. At 4 AM, while giving chase to their fleeing enemy in the exercise, Captain Nikolai Zateyev was informed of a problem. The aft reactor, controlling the starboard propeller, had experienced a sudden pressure drop. It turns out that the huge pressure spike during testing had caused deformations of the piping for the coolant to the reactor. This had led to stress being put on the welded and soldered areas of the pipes, and, after months of continuous operation, they had finally reached their breaking point. But Zateyev was not aware of the danger. The appropriate response would be to shut down the reactor and seek emergency assistance from nearby submarines, but instead they continued the pursuit exercise. At approximately 7 minutes past 4, the pipe to the pressure gauge completely burst. Water shot out from 200 atmospheres of pressure down to 1. For those who don't know, when you increase the pressure of a liquid, the boiling point also increases. The water inside the VMA core was 310 degrees Celsius. Now it was flashing into steam and filling the reactor compartment. Control rods inserted, and the reactor was shut down. As the reaction required water for neutron moderation, the loss of water also meant the risk of criticality restarting continued to decrease. But there was also nothing to carry heat away from the fuel rods, the temperature of which was climbing due to decay heat. The temperature in the reactor compartment was climbing as well, rising beyond 140 degrees Celsius, the limit of temperature measurement for the equipment. Radiation also sharply increased, reaching 50 roentgens per hour in the reactor control room. Crew ran from compartment to compartment, trying to help with the situation, while senior crew all met up to discuss what they were going to have to do. In doing so, the doors between the compartments were left open, breaking the hermetic seals and causing elevated radiation readings throughout the ship. The reactor fuel was already approaching 500 degrees Celsius, and they needed to cool it. The crew were so focused, however, trying to find the source of the leak, that they didn't realise the high-pressure receiver cylinders, which could have maintained the pressure in the core, were disconnected during the shutdown. At 4:22, the submarine surfaced while they were trying to increase pressure using the auxiliary pump, with no results. So, they changed tactics, and at 7 AM, a team headed by Lieutenant Mikhail Krasichkov got ready to enter the reactor. Their task was simple: use the dismantled sections of the water supply and weapon system to assemble an emergency cooling system. One of his men, Yuri Ordochkin, was nervous about the situation. If the temperature was climbing, could there be an explosion? Krasichkov comforted him, gave him all the numbers they had. Then an alarm sounded above them, signifying they had to enter the compartment. Without hesitation, Ordochkin did, with the rest of the engineers. While the submarine was being cannibalized to save the reactor, many of the crew had different plans. They were much more content deliberately sinking the submarine and the crew being safely left on Zhammayan Island, until a rescue could be formulated. Zatayev overruled them. They were going to save that submarine. To prevent a mutiny, Zatayev made a simple order: sink all the weapons, leaving only pistols for the loyal officers, including himself and Vasily Arkhipov, who was acting as the backup captain second class on the submarine, helping to enforce strict discipline on board. Inside the reactor compartment, the engineers struggled in the conditions. Working atop the reactor, the temperatures were extremely high, and the radiation immeasurably dangerous. That same steam that had been sprayed out of the core when the leak formed had condensed to water, and was flooding the bottom of the compartment, heavily contaminated. Above, the men struggled in thick protective suits, and gas masks that had to be removed if they wanted to talk to one another. Alternating every 10 minutes, teams of 3, led by Krasichkov and Chief Petty Officer Boris Rizhikov, would attack the situation, trying to find an appropriate pipe that could be assembled as part of a temporary cooling system, connecting the auxiliary or main circulation pump to the core to restart the flow of water. But these failed. The rubber hose burst off. Eventually, they managed to find the appropriate piping. It was piping from the torpedo system, intended to achieve the high pressures required for launching torpedoes, and therefore suitable for the task at hand. Still working in groups, they began to weld the piping together. Steady at first, and then slow as cracks and deformations appeared. But finally, they were close to success. As work progressed, another man joined the fray, Lieutenant Boris Korchilov, 23 years old, described as a handsome young man, blue-eyed. A survivor of the siege of Leningrad as a child, he'd been stationed on K-19 for 8 months. Despite the fact that he was supposed to be commanding the torpedo compartment, his task had been relieved, and he decided to help in any way he could. Zatayev looked at him. "Boris, do you know what you're getting into?" "Yes, Comrade Commander." "Well, then with God." Korchilov entered the room and found the man in charge of the shift, Krasichkov. Korchilov told him that he had been relieved, and so Krazichkov left the compartment. He made his way to the remote control for the pump and moved to turn it on. The instant it was turned on, the men in the reactor compartment reported blue flames shooting out of the top of the reactor. As it turns out, the introduction of water had interacted with the damaged fuel rods and actually restarted criticality, creating an intense neutron surge. This also interacted with the water, forming blue flames of ionized hydrogen. They extinguished themselves as the criticality subsided. Everyone in the room at the time had just received a death sentence. They were quickly evacuated out. The submarine's movements had been slowed. The port reactor was still running, and K-19 moved at a speed of 10 knots south towards home. The high-range communication systems had been destroyed during their earlier exercises, and they were dependent on anyone picking up their frequencies during broadcast hours. Zatayev was now content with scuttling the submarine at the sign of any vessel carrying a red flag, be it destroyer or fishing trawler. Their speed was greatly hampered by the loss of the diesel generators. To pump out the radioactive water that had leaked from the reactor into compartment 6, a pipeline was hastily assembled to connect it to a larger pump in compartment 3. This inadvertently contaminated compartments 4 and 5, leaving the diesel generators unusable. At midday, K-19 gave an emergency broadcast. "We have a reactor accident. The personnel have been overexposed. We need help. Latitude 68 degrees north, longitude 4 degrees. Only one vessel heard the signal and arrived to help an hour later. Submarine S-107. It took another hour for the submarines to dock, and 3 men were carried over by stretchers. Their bodies were so contaminated the compartments they were in reached half a roentgen an hour. At 4 PM, the welding failed, and the reactor temperature began to rise again. 3 men were sent to apply rubber coatings over the pipelines, surviving and continuing the cooling of the core. At 3 PM the following day, a second submarine arrived to help, S-259. Crew were transferred to the 2 rescue vessels, leaving K-19 abandoned. Finally, the crew were then transported to the destroyers that made their way to the scene. After a storm had passed, while K-19 was prepared for sinking should NATO forces arrive, the towing process began. When the destroyers returned to shore, the groups of heavily irradiated crewmen were evacuated to hospital. But for many, little could be done. Boris Korchilov died on July 10th, 1961, receiving a dose of 54 sieverts from just a few minutes in the reactor compartment. Yuri Orjichkin, the man whom Krazichkov calmed and convinced to enter the reactor compartment alongside him, died the same day as Korchilov. He received approximately 30 sieverts of radiation. Boris Rizhikov, the superior leading the second group of engineers, also succumbed to radiation. He survived until July 25th, 1961. Krazichkov would survive, receiving a successful bone marrow transplant and many blood transfusions. The USSR would conceal the deaths of the men, with some being listed as simply electrocution. For the survivors, radiation exposure was instead listed as astheno-vegetative syndrome, a neurological condition that torpedoed the careers of many survivors. Subsequent analysis indicated that the leak that caused the accident was extremely minor, and the pressure was retained in the circuit. In other words, the risk of a catastrophic meltdown was deemed impossible. Further calculations by Anatoly Alexandrov concluded that the risk of an explosion in the event of a meltdown was effectively zero, as the fuel would be unable to go critical without sufficient moderation. The crew would never know it, but they died for nothing. This is where the story of K-19 was supposed to end. The crews were dead. The reactor compartment was completely destroyed. Piping throughout the ship had been cannibalized for the temporary reactor cooling system. It was a monumental task to consider repairing it. The state commission tasked with assessing the accident, headed by Anatoly Alexandrov, concluded the only option was to deliberately sink the submarine to dispose of it. But the crew refused to do so. Their friends had died to save that submarine, and it would be meaningless if it was just left to rust, they decided. And so the crew decided to one by one decontaminate every compartment of the submarine and unload the warheads from the submarine, which were transferred to the Submarine K-107. The commission turned a blind eye to the events, leaving them to risk harmful radiation exposure. In December of 1961, decontamination was completed, and the submarine was towed to Severodvinsk to get repaired. It was decided that they would upgrade K-19 to a Project 658M, finally giving the subsurface missile launchers planned for the design. As for the reactor compartment, considered impossible to decontaminate and too radioactive to even suggest unloading the fuel from the intact reactor, it was cut out of the submarine. The damaged reactor compartment was then filled with a furfural preservative and taken all the way to Novaya Zemlya, the Soviet Union's testing grounds for large nuclear bombs, including the Tsar bomber, and subsequently sunk to the bottom of the Abrosimov Bay, where it would be contained for up to 500 years. A new reactor compartment was assembled, and the two halves of K-19 were attached around it. In October of 1962, K-19's modernisation was completed, and it was sent for trials. 1 year and 3 months after K-19's accident, it unintentionally saved the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis was heating up, and Vasily Arkhipov, having survived the K-19 accident with a bolstered career, for his actions preventing a breakdown of order on board, was faced with a difficult decision: whether to launch their nuclear torpedoes at a US ship that was using signal depth charges to force them to the surface. While Captain Savitsky and political officer Maslenikov were prepared to launch the torpedo, unsure if nuclear war had broken out, Arkhipov dissented, suggesting they instead surface to receive orders from the Soviet Union. His actions aboard K-19 managed to convince Savitsky and Maslenikov to change their minds. The submarine they were aboard, B-59, surfaced, and was called back to the Soviet Union, where Archipov's actions were admonished. Admirals told the crew upon return they should have gone down with the ship. That same month, K-19's trials were completed, and it was accepted for use by the Soviet Navy once more. Beyond combat service in 1966, K-19 saw little action for the rest of the decade. She did receive the Red Banner of the USSR Council of Ministers in 1967, as she won a tactical training competition. But little else happened until November of 1969. On the morning of November 15th, K-19 was 25 miles off of shore, in neutral waters. The crew of submarine K-40 was on board, training. The captain, Libetko, was not at the helm, having charted a course, and was instructing his deputy, Shabanov, what was described as military affairs in the real way. Imagine a lot of slamming on tables and against the automatic plotting device used. They managed to finally calm everything down by sending the crew on an early breakfast. In doing so, they also sent the most senior sonarman on board off post, replacing them with an inexperienced crewman while the submarine was diving. Therefore, the sound on the sonar of an approaching craft was not noticed. At approximately 4:15 AM, the crew in the submarine felt a sudden jolt forward and downward. Had they hit rocks? Impossible. They'd just been charting the position of the submarine. They were far away from any of them. Crew ran up to the bridge as the submarine surfaced and looked down at the front of the ship. All seemed fine. At a slow speed, K-19 returned back to port, where they finally saw the damage. The front of K-19 had been crushed all the way up to the torpedo tubes. where it had impacted whatever it was they collided with. The investigation was harsh. People interviewed were brought to tears as the commission raked them over the coals for minor mistakes. But in the end, it was decided it was the fault of no one. Meanwhile, the Americans had almost started World War III. As it turns out, K-19 had collided with another nuclear submarine, the USS Gato. K-19 had impacted the submarine perpendicular to the Gato, tearing open a small hole in the side of the submarine and sending it diving 100 meters. The mine and torpedo commander was ready to deploy 3 torpedoes and a nuclear anti-submarine missile against K-19. But the commander of the USS Gato, Lawrence Burkhart, countermanded the order. The USS Gato was able to slowly sneak back to base, having avoided catastrophe, and Burkhart was removed from command of the submarine. Nuclear war was avoided. K-19 returned for repairs, and in March of 1970, her crew set out again on board K-40 for more exercises. On March 30th, the submarine was given orders to surface and return to base. As they did, a dense fog set in, so dense that the captain third rank on shift was smoking on the bridge when a ship sailed past so close the spray splashed over the submarine. They'd almost collided, and he didn't see the ship. Up ahead, a new ship appeared on the radar, and as they watched the blip get closer, they realised something. They were headed straight for it. Evasive manoeuvres were taken, but the boat ahead copied them, and then it disappeared from radar. It entered the blind spot. K-40 collided with a fishing trawler. Everyone on board was drunk and had ignored the warnings of the approaching submarine. The trawler later sank from the damage. It seems that even the crew of K-19 were victims of the curse. Once K-19 was fully repaired and operational again, in October of 1970, she undertook her second combat service, and there were no disasters. It returned to base on December 9th, safe and successful. And between April and June of 1971, she completed her third service. With her third combat service complete, the submarine enjoyed a 6-month break from duty, and then in January of 1972, she returned to the open seas for her fourth combat service. On February 17th, operating in the North Atlantic, there was an issue with the hydraulic system to the rudder in compartment 9. A small crack had appeared in the pipeline and oil began leaking out. Not ideal, but easily repairable. Unfortunately, they could not remove the oil that had leaked out, which had escaped into the lower inaccessible areas of the compartment. This did not necessarily matter. All they had to do was wait for the combat mission to end and pump it out then. What they didn't know was that for the next 7 days, the oil worked its way down through the components until it encountered a carbon monoxide combustion device. In the high temperature, at 10:23 AM on February 24th, it ignited. A sailor quickly spotted the blaze, but instead of sounding the alarm or attempting to put out the fire himself, he left to wake up the commander of the apparatus. A firefighting crew was quickly organised, but they lacked respirators, and were just sent straight into the blaze. The crew's hesitation to act would cost them. The fire was spewing toxic gases, and many were falling unconscious from oxygen deprivation. As if answering the irony, the fire reached the pipeline carrying compressed air through the submarine. It ruptured and exploded, the oxygen fueling the fire. With that, the submarine, at a depth of 120 meters, was to become the site of death for more than 24 people. More visually threatening than the accident 10.5 years earlier. At 10:54 AM, the fire alarm sounded, and the order to seal all doors between the compartments was given, isolating the fire. Everyone still conscious in compartment 9 hurried to compartment 8, while they held the blaze back. Nobody could go back for those incapacitated by the smoke. A wall of fire soon filled the corridor, and they sealed it, condemning many to death. On the other side, compartment 10, 12 people were asleep when the doors were closed, trapping them. The air supply was also stopped. They were able to communicate with compartment 1 initially. However, the wiring was soon destroyed by the blaze, isolating them from the world. The submarine began rising to the surface, but the blaze was not going to cease. The smoke, and, in particular, carbon monoxide that was supposed to be combusted, was now spreading into compartment 8 through the air system. Everyone evacuated was now sent down to compartment 7, along with most of the crew stationed. Only the captain 3rd rank Lev Siganka and the other heads of the electrical division stayed at their post. They closed the door between compartments 8 and 7, sealing themselves off. They had to keep the generators running as long as possible so the submarine could keep rising, knowing in the end they would all suffocate. And the smoke continued through the air into compartment 7. Now the turbines were under threat. At the same time, it reached compartment 6, the reactor compartment. The reactors were shut down, and the sailor Alexander Novikov began handing out gas masks to all the men, putting them on for them. He did not put on his own, and succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning. In the turbine room, the scene was far worse. While many had gas masks, the carbon monoxide was so dense it could suffocate by passing under the gas mask, and there were those that would remove it and fall unconscious in seconds, dying without even letting go of the controls. The submarine reached the surface at 10:56 am, and they could finally begin venting the smoke. With the reactors shut down, attention swung to the emergency diesel generators, but they were impossible to turn on in the pitch black conditions, hampered by the smoke that was still pouring in through the ventilation. And in their haste to evacuate, an air valve was improperly closed. 200 tons of water entered compartment 5, flooding the diesel generators and ventilation equipment. K-19 was surfaced, powerless and without help. They managed to send a quick broadcast for aid, but it was not going to arrive for a while. There was a storm approaching. Meanwhile, in the very aft compartment, compartment 10, the 12 sailors still trapped in the pitch black waited and used their flashlights to raid the lockers of all the food supplies they had. It wasn't much. 4 packs of teas, 2 cans of condensed milk, and some canned cabbage. To last 12 sailors, however long it took. Air was supplied by a pipe used to adjust the submarine's trim, while CO2 was removed through a depth gauge pipeline. After 2 days of vicious storms, the first ship to respond to the distress call arrived, a container ship by the name of the Angales. But it was impossible to transport the wounded or those trapped in compartment 10. The storm was still too severe. By March 8th, more than 3 dozen ships had arrived at the scene, including the ship Vice Admiral Drost. One of these was able to attach a cable to the submarine, allowing them to supply electricity. In the storm, the cable snapped off, so they tried again, the same result. But they kept trying, and failing. On the 8th attempt, the cable stayed in place. Finally, they had electricity. Pressurized air was pumped into the submarine, and emergency lighting was installed. The crew were finally free. 32 were evacuated by helicopter to Vice Admiral Drost, while 52 had to climb the tether to the tugboat. Among those lifted by helicopter were the emaciated survivors in compartment 10 on March 18th. As the tugboats guided K-19 back to port, an emergency crew were transferred into the submarine. Going compartment by compartment, they cleared the air and set up a lighting system, going through all the way past the reactors and turbines, and finally beyond where the fire started. And then they reached compartment 10. They were all still alive. In order to survive, they had gone to extreme measures. No food, no light, and no communication outside of the cramped area. To collect water, they survived on a small, apparently disgusting tank. and when that ran out, they relied on condensation that collected on the walls. The survivors had to be blindfolded on their way out of the submarine, as after 23 days in the dark, the sun would have blinded them. But even with this transfer, their trouble was still not over. One unfortunate rescue sailor was washed away while transferring to K-19 during the storms. Another sailor, a member of the crew of the Magomay Gadzhiev, was fatally injured when the storm worsened. The submarine would eventually wind up back in Severodvinsk. The last few crew members remaining on board being an emergency rescue team and the commander of K-19, Vladimir Kulibaba. In the subsequent investigation, he was cleared of wrongdoing. He was unaware of the oil hazard and every action he took was assessed as correct. Those deemed at fault had perished in the blaze. On their way back to the base after repairs, another fire broke out at the port on arrival, with lumber igniting. People on shore and several tugboats were sent to extinguish the fire, and they were successful without injuries. The repairs of K-19 were quick and easy. The problems that would inevitably kill the crew had emerged from smoke, not fire. In January of 1973, K-19 was back on the seas completing combat missions, deemed excellent. In early 1974, they completed their 6th combat service, again deemed excellent. In 1975, K-19 was modernised, but there were no combat missions to come. Aside from a fire of the insulation in 1978, which was quickly extinguished, nothing happened. The design was now approaching 20 years old, and it was functionally obsolete against modern submarines. In 1979, it was converted into a communication submarine, renamed KS-19. Still, no missions would come, and with all the experimental weapons and systems installed on her to test their capabilities, it didn't seem any would come. The equipment would be tested over 65 dives and 20,000 miles submerged between 1980 and 1982. And it worked. The submarine seemed to have a future. But even as a communication submarine, the curse still held strong. On August 17, 1982, workers were performing maintenance in the battery compartment. At 6:01 in the evening, someone dropped a metal object on the multipolarity buses, causing a short circuit followed by a flaming electrical arc. 2 people were burned severely, and a third, Kravchuk, died in hospital 3 days later. Kravchuk would be the final fatality of K-19. The problem was now that communications advancements were stretching beyond K-19's capabilities. She was becoming purposeless. In 1984, just 5 years after new equipment was installed, all dives were paused, while the crew were trained on new equipment, which had to be installed over the following 2 years. And by the time KS-19 was up to date, as a communication submarine, a petition had been put into place to decommission her. There were already better replacements after almost 7 years of work. It was time for the submarine to meet its fate. When the petition for decommissioning was accepted in 1988, the crew was very suddenly cut from 114 to 44 people, much less than was required to maintain her. And so she was laid up year after year, first in Ara Bay, then Parla Bay, then Ura Bay. Sitting, waiting. By this point in time, the story of the Hiroshima of the seas had gone mainstream and attracted Hollywood interest. Widowmaker, their loosely historical film adaptation of the 1961 incident, was intended to be filmed on the submarine itself. However, the Commander-in-Chief refused to allow filming. Widowmaker released in 2002 and did not perform well at the box office, making just $65 million on a $90 million budget. In March of that year, KS-19, now renamed to BS-19, was towed to its final destination, Nerpa Shipyard. But BS-19 could not go quietly without one last accident, and on March 26th, a tow line mishap caused the submarine to ram a tugboat. Fortunately, there were no injuries, and at last, the infamous K-19 would be dismantled, cut into pieces, sold for scrap. But even though K-19 was now condemned to death, fate never seems to be direct in any of these stories. As former crew attended a farewell ceremony, a former cook on board turned multimillionaire, Vladimir Romanov, bribed the head of the plant with $100,000 to spare the conning tower, the race section of the submarine. While the rest of the submarine was dismantled, the conning tower eventually ended up in the car park of the Nerva shipyard. In 2018, Romanov returned to transport it, having to bribe the new director another $100,000, plus 1.6 million rubles to cut the conning tower into 11 pieces, and transport it to the south coast of the Achinskoye Reservoir, north of Moscow. The conning tower was then mounted on a concrete base resembling the silhouette of K-19's once huge hull, to remain there. Originally intended as a meeting place for former crew of the K-19 submarine, much to the crew's protest, these plans changed when Romanov became a political refugee after he was exposed for his role in a huge Russian money laundering scheme, the Troika Laundromat. Using the last of his money, he reportedly refurbished K-19's conning tower into his own home, calling it the last thing he has left. In 2020, Rosatom, Russia's state-owned nuclear energy corporation, announced plans to raise sunken nuclear hazards, including K-19's reactor compartment, by 2026. In September of 2021, expeditions off the coast of Novaya Zemlya located the sunken remains of K-19's original reactor compartment, still intact. The Russian government is currently left with a tough decision. They can either leave K-19's reactors there, or raise them. While they may seem fine for now, there are prospects of drilling for oil around the site, and so in that case, it will have to be disposed of. Nothing more recent has emerged in the news. This is where the K-19 story ends. While efforts to monitor and potentially raise the reactor compartment continue off the coast of Novaya Zemlya, the conning tower of K-19 still stands by the shore of the Achinskoye Reservoir, pointing towards the Moscow Canal, waiting for the days she will take to the seas again. A day that will never come.